there's a peculiar theme emerging from the White House in which Donald Trump continually asserts that Ukraine started this war, that they could have ended it, that somehow this could have been sorted years ago. Where does this come from?
Well, as ever, the perpetual question about what's shaping Donald Trump's mind is something that, is now we're going to be doing this for years, and we've done it for many years, and every morning something new comes, and this is a classic example of that. I mean, I just point, for example, to a tweet by Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, who is a loyal Trump supporter and is desperate to try and bridge the divide between saying Donald Trump will support Ukraine, and that's a position he's finding hard to balance. But he, literally in the last few moments, has given his interpretation of how to answer your question. And he said basically of course, Ukraine didn't start the war. He says you might as well have said America attacked Japan. Of course, a country undergoing an invasion should not be staging elections. The UK didn't do it during the Second World War. And of course, Zelensky's ratings are not the 4%. They're actually the same as Trump's. But Trump is saying this to try to shock the Europeans into action. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is President Zelensky's, that there's a sort of disinformation bubble around Donald Trump. There are many more critical interpretations. I go to meetings with policy people, intelligence people, American politicians, European politicians, and they say that there is something fantastical in the literal sense of the word about a lot of the thinking that is coming out of the White House at the moment. That we're wrong to try and impose structure. Right. And meaning and strategy within it. One of the things that was fascinating about yesterday's talks in Saudi Arabia was just how little sense there was of an actual plan.
Yeah. I mean, we always come back to this idea that he's the expert negotiator. But if you were to look at the last week, the United States has crossed quite a lot of red lines. There's been a lot of concessions. I've just listened to Sergei Lavrov in front of the Duma, and I don't see any concessions from him. It looks less like a negotiation and more like the capitulation that we saw in Afghanistan with the Taliban at this point.
I spoke to one American politician recently, nameless, it was off the record, and he said, look, if you want to really negotiate with Putin, you go and say, right, we're going to do a deal, and if you don't agree to the deal, we are going to seize all your frozen assets, $300 billion worth. We are going to increase sanctions on Russia. We are going to give Ukraine everything it wants, the deep strikes, the resources it needs to actually push back against Russia in the east. Oh yeah, and by the way, remember we took Ukraine's nuclear weapons away from it and in return gave it security guarantees all those years ago. Well, that didn't work. Maybe we'll give Ukraine its nuclear weapons back. Now, the fact that a mainstream American politician, obviously an opponent of Trump, was prepared even to link nuclear weapons in that list and saying, right, that's how you negotiate. You don't go in and do what Mr. Trump's team seem to have done. So, again, but you speak to others who say, well, look, maybe there's a strategy here. Maybe you throw everything, the kitchen sink at the Russians, and it just brings them to the table. The fear, though, is that actually what's happening is the desire by the Americans to get a fast deal is the risk is that you end up getting a bad deal that is a deal that the Ukrainians don't accept.
I mean, you listen to Sergei Lavrov today in the Duma, and he's hanging on to the talking points now from Donald Trump, saying, "Yeah, we agree with him."
Yeah,
this is exactly what we're
praising him.
Specifically when it comes to NATO membership. What it does do is it puts all the focus on this meeting next week for Sir Keir Starmer in Washington, who wants to sort of exist as a bridge between the Europeans, Ukraine and Washington. The only danger is he's from the opposite side of the political tracks. Maybe actually Boris Johnson's the better person to deal with this.
I mean, what's interesting, the mood out of Washington is that actually Team Trump want to work with Team Starmer because Trump sees Starmer as one of the European politicians who's going to be around. Regardless of what happens over the next 4 years, Starmer's going to be here, whereas a lot of the other European leaders are not. Schulz is likely to go shortly. The future of Macron. There are lots of other governments in Europe that have weak coalition governments with leaderships changing all the time. So I think there is the Americans say actually whatever, regardless of the politics, there's a sort of a permanence about Starmer that means they want to maintain a relationship, which I think is an interesting lever to use. The question is this: yes. Talk of a bridge. That's the idea of the UK being a bridge between Europe and America is an old one. The bigger debate that's happening now is actually, do we need to think about a bridge to the United States, or do we need to think about Europe just doing its own thing? Across the board, not just in terms of defence spending, but broad. I was talking to somebody recently who said, should the UK stop investing in the F-35 programme so much? Because what happens if the Americans withdraw their cooperation on that? Because there are so many. In other words, how does Europe, instead of thinking about bridges to the United States, does it reach a conclusion that the US is a less reliable ally than it has been in the past, and needs to think differently about how it does things across the board?
Yeah. I mean, the involvement of Boris Johnson, I know, would be anathema to Labour supporters. I just raise it because he clearly is trying to intervene in the argument. But obviously this is for Sir Keir Starmer to pursue. Just on the issue of the finances, I mean, if you look at who Russia sent yesterday, the head of one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds, if not the biggest sovereign wealth fund in Russia, this feels like an economic deal. And of course, Donald Trump, first and foremost, is a businessman. He's already talked about taking the minerals and putting on the table a sort of a package of compensation for the US taxpayer, which I'm sure would make Ukrainians wince. What about the money that is frozen in European bank accounts? Because the MP Goncharenko today has said we should just take that, use that, and go our own way, as you've just suggested.
Well, the debate is the tension over that has always been, look, if you seize assets, right? At the moment, all we're doing is we're creaming off the dividends, if you like, the interest, which has been used to support Ukraine, but it's still just frozen assets, it's not seized assets. Now, there has been reluctance to seize those assets and just give them to Ukraine, because if the Europeans did that, then the fear is that other financial jurisdictions around the world would say, well, hang on a minute, if these assets can now be stolen, then there's lack of security, you'd get an economic breakdown. In other words, because you're breaking the fundamental rules of international finance. The counter-argument to that now is, look, we're beyond that. We're beyond those kind of arguments about, financial concerns. We're in more an existential space. So yes, let's use that money. Let's actually not just use it, for interest, but take that money and just use it to support the Ukrainians. In the same way that people are saying, look, in all the debates about defence spending in Europe, we're talking not about, the usual, the Treasury says this and the defence chief said that. It's about saying, no, we need to fundamentally suspend the traditional European welfare model for a period of time and stop giving so much money to schools, hospitals and welfare and give it to defence. And that's the space that people are moving into and saying that's the sort of debate we've got to have. And the question is there political leadership to do that? Do voters want to go to that space? How are they countries ready to do that?
Why should Europe pick up the reparations for Ukraine if that money is there? They would say.
Correct. Well, reparations normally, remember, the aggressor, the defeated party, pays those reparations, not the victim. But you're absolutely right that there is a very clear economic dimension in America, in the White House's mind, as to the deal they want to get out of this. Now, remember, Zelensky raised this himself because everybody was thinking, how do you get into Mr. Trump's mindset? And Zelensky himself raised this issue of maybe doing some deals, giving US access to some Ukrainian rare earths to say, look, transactional. But essentially, he's offered an inch, and Trump is demanding a mile.
Yeah. Yes, Europe paying the reconstruction, not the reparations, as you quite rightly say, but I can see why they might be interested in the money. Good to talk to you. James Landale there.